My name is Era Taylor. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate operations. One of those quiet roles where everything functions smoothly if you're doing your job well, and almost no one notices you doing it. That has never bothered me. In fact, people have always assumed I prefer it that way. I'm the person who speaks softly in meetings, the one who takes notes when everyone else is arguing about strategy, the one who quietly sends a follow up email later that somehow resolves three problems no one realized were connected. Most of my coworkers would probably describe me with words like reliable, calm, maybe a little reserved. If they were being generous, they might say something thoughtful. If they were being honest, they might say, I'm easy to overlook. And for a long time, that was fine. Because when you're the person everyone underestimates, you see things other people miss. You notice who interrupts whom. You notice who takes credit for work they didn't do. You notice which jokes aren't really jokes at all. But you also notice something else: the quiet patterns that form in offices over time. The small moments when respect erodes, just a little. Not enough for anyone to call it out, just enough that it becomes normal. That's the kind of story this is. It didn't start with shouting or dramatic confrontations. There was no explosive scandal, no viral HR complaint, no dramatic resignation letter thrown across a conference table. Instead, it started with something that, on the surface, felt almost trivial. One morning, my manager forced the entire team to attend a 7 a.m. emergency meeting. Everyone rushed into the conference room half awake, laptops in hand, convinced something had gone terribly wrong with a major project. We thought maybe a client had pulled out, or the quarterly numbers had collapsed overnight. Instead, he spent the next 30 minutes asking us to vote on a trade for his fantasy football league. That moment sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. And at the time, most people laughed it off. But moments like that are rarely just about the moment itself. They're about what they reveal, about the roles people quietly assign each other, about what happens when someone assumes your time and your respect are infinitely flexible. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't even really about him. It's about what happens when a person who has spent years being useful and invisible finally decides to see the situation clearly and then chooses a different path. Not loudly, not dramatically, just deliberately. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how that small, strange meeting became the beginning of one of the most important decisions I've ever made, both professionally and personally. Because sometimes the moment that changes everything isn't the one that shocks the room. It's the one that quietly changes how you see the room. And once that happens, things rarely go back to the way they were. But before we get into all of that, there's something important you should know about the person telling this story. Because the version of me my coworkers thought they understood wasn't the whole picture. If you had asked anyone in my office who I was, the answers would have been surprisingly consistent. Era, oh, she's great, super organized. Yeah, she keeps everything running. She's the one who always knows where the files are. None of those answers was wrong. They just weren't complete. I worked as a senior operations coordinator at a mid-sized tech company in Seattle. On paper, it sounded like a logistical role. Calendars, project coordination, documentation, vendor communication. The kind of job that lives somewhere between management and support. In reality, it was the nervous system of the entire department. I knew which vendors were reliable and which ones quietly missed deadlines. I knew which contracts had small clauses that could save the company thousands of dollars if someone actually noticed them. I knew how to route problems through the organization so they got solved quickly without triggering unnecessary panic. But knowledge like that is invisible. It doesn't show up in flashy presentations or quarterly all hands meetings. It just quietly keeps the machine from breaking. And because of that, people tend to assume the person behind it is replaceable. My manager, Derek Lawson, certainly seemed to think so. Derek wasn't a bad person in the dramatic sense. He wasn't cruel or openly hostile. In fact, he had the kind of personality that made him seem easy to like in short conversations. He joked with people in the hallway. He used everyone's first names. He liked to describe the team as a family, which in corporate language usually means something slightly different. But Derek had a particular blind spot. He believed the most important work in the room was the work that looked important. Big presentations, strategy meetings, leadership calls, the quieter work, the spreadsheets that prevented financial errors, the compliance checks that avoided legal headaches, the coordination that kept projects moving. Those things simply blended into the background. And because that work was mostly mine, so was I. During meetings, I usually sat slightly to the side of the table with my notebook open. I didn't interrupt people. I didn't compete for attention. When someone asked a question about timelines or documentation, Derek would often pause for a moment and then say something like, "Era probably knows." And I usually did. I'd answer calmly, flip to the right page in my notebook, explain the detail they needed, and then the conversation would continue as if the information had simply appeared. After a while, I realized something interesting. The less you demand attention, the more people assume you don't need it. It's not always malicious. Most of the time, it's just human nature. People naturally organize social spaces around visible signals: confidence, volume, authority. Quiet competence rarely registers as power. So my coworkers saw me as helpful, reliable, low maintenance. If a meeting needed notes, I took them. If someone forgot to send an attachment to a client, I caught it before it caused embarrassment. If a vendor invoice looked wrong, I flagged it before finance processed the payment. Small things, quiet things, the kind of work that makes other people's days easier. And because I did those things consistently, a subtle role formed around me. Not one that was ever discussed out loud, but one thing everyone seemed to understand. I was the person who made problems disappear. Not the person who created direction. Not the person whose time was particularly valuable. Just the one who would handle things. Even Derek treated it that way sometimes. He'd drop tasks into my inbox late in the afternoon with a message like, "Hey, Era, quick thing when you get a chance." The quick thing would usually involve 3 departments and a spreadsheet with 6 tabs. And I'd do it. Not because I felt obligated, but because I believed in doing work well when you accept responsibility for it. That belief had carried me through most of my career. But belief and perception are two very different things. To the people around me, I wasn't the quiet center of operational stability. I was simply the calm, reliable woman with the notebook who always seemed to be available. Someone easy to rely on, someone easy to overlook. And the truth is, I didn't fully realize how deeply that role had settled into the culture of our team. Not yet. That realization would come later. It started with something small. So small that most of my coworkers forgot it within minutes. But I didn't. Because sometimes the first sign that something is wrong isn't loud. It's just a tiny moment where respect slips and no one seems to notice. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel dramatic at the time. In fact, if you had asked anyone else on the team about it later, they probably wouldn't have remembered it at all. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon during one of our regular Project Sync meetings. Those meetings were always the same: 15 people in a glass conference room, half of them speaking, the other half checking Slack messages under the table. Derek would stand near the screen with a slide deck open, moving quickly through timelines while the rest of us filled in details. I sat where I usually sat, near the end of the table, my navy notebook open. About halfway through the meeting, Derek paused on a slide showing a vendor delivery schedule. There was a small inconsistency in the timeline, something that could easily create a 2-week delay if it wasn't caught early. He frowned slightly. "Wait," he said, pointing at the screen. "Why does this say the compliance review happens after deployment?" The room got quiet. A couple of people looked at each other. Someone shrugged. Before anyone else could respond, I glanced down at my notebook and then back at the slide. "It's actually before deployment," I said calmly. "The vendor updated their schedule last Friday. I sent the revised timeline in the Monday report." Derek turned toward me. For a moment, I thought the conversation would simply move forward. Instead, he smiled. One of those quick, casual smiles people use when they think they're being funny. "Ah," he said, nodding toward the table. "That's why we keep Era around." A few people laughed, not loudly. Just that light, polite office laughter that happens when a manager makes a comment that might be a joke. I smiled too. It was automatic, the way people smile when they don't want to interrupt the flow of a room. But something about the phrasing stayed with me. "That's why we keep Era around." It wasn't meant as an insult. I knew that. Derek probably thought he was giving me credit for noticing something useful. But the sentence had a strange weight to it. Not "Era identified the issue," not "good catch." Just a passing acknowledgement that I existed in the room to catch small mistakes, like a helpful system notification. The meeting continued, and the moment disappeared into the usual rhythm of updates and deadlines. But I wrote the sentence down in my notebook, not because I was upset, mostly because I've always had the habit of documenting things that feel slightly off. Not dramatic problems, just patterns. After the meeting ended, people filtered out of the conference room in clusters, talking about lunch plans or upcoming deadlines. As I packed my notebook into my bag, one of my coworkers, Lena, paused beside me. "Good catch back there," she said quietly. I smiled. "Thanks." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "Derek just talks like that sometimes. Don't take it personally." That was interesting. I hadn't said anything about taking it personally. "I know," I told her. "It's fine." And it was fine. At least it seemed fine. Because moments like that happen in offices all the time. A comment that lands slightly wrong, a joke that's a little too casual, a phrase that quietly reduces someone's contribution without anyone fully realizing it. Most people move past those moments quickly. I usually did too. But something about that sentence stayed in my mind during the walk back to my desk. Not because it hurt, because it clarified something. The role people had placed me in was smaller than the role I was actually playing. And the difference between those two things can grow surprisingly wide over time. I opened my laptop, pulled up the vendor documentation, and corrected the timeline in the shared project tracker. Then, I wrote a quick follow up email to the team summarizing the update. By the end of the afternoon, everything was aligned again. The problem had disappeared, just like it always did. But that little sentence Derek said in the meeting lingered quietly in the back of my mind. Because sometimes the first small cut isn't the one that causes damage. It's the one that shows you where the blade is. And once you see it, you start noticing how often it appears. After that meeting, nothing dramatic changed. That's the strange thing about subtle disrespect in a workplace. It rarely arrives as a single obvious event. It's more like background noise, small comments, slight assumptions, tiny adjustments in how people treat your time or your contributions. And because each moment feels minor on its own, it becomes easy for everyone to accept it as normal, including you. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern that had probably been there for much longer. Derek had a habit of assigning work in a very casual way, not formal requests or scheduled planning, just quick messages that appeared in Slack late in the day. Hey, Era, quick thing when you get a second. At first glance, they always sounded simple, but when I opened the tasks, they were rarely small. Sometimes, they involved coordinating across 3 teams. Sometimes, they meant reorganizing documentation for an entire project cycle. Occasionally, they required digging through months of archived reports to reconstruct a timeline someone else had lost track of. I did them all, partly because I knew how important those details were. Partly because I had always believed that if you're responsible for something, you should do it well. And if I'm being honest, partly because I had quietly accepted the role the team had given me. Reliable, efficient, invisible. One afternoon, about a month after that meeting, another moment happened that most people probably forgot within seconds. We were in the middle of a planning session for an upcoming product rollout. The room was crowded, people speaking over each other, while Derek tried to move through the agenda. At one point, the conversation stalled around a compliance approval deadline. Do we know when legal signed off on the documentation? Someone asked. A few people shook their heads. Before I could speak, Derek waved his hand toward me without even looking. Era will figure it out, he said. She always does. The room moved on instantly. No one questioned it. No one asked if I had the time. No one even asked if I was already working on something else. It was just assumed. And I wrote that sentence down too. Not out of resentment, out of curiosity. Because once you start documenting patterns, they become easier to see. That week alone, I counted 6 similar moments. None of them was aggressive. None of them sounded intentionally dismissive. But they all carried the same quiet message. Era will handle it. Not because I had volunteered, because that was the role everyone had grown comfortable assigning me. I thought about addressing it once or twice. Not dramatically, just a small clarification. Something like, actually, I'm already managing 3 timelines this week. We might want to assign that elsewhere. But each time the thought appeared, another voice followed it. It's not worth making it awkward. Everyone is under pressure. You can handle it. So I stayed quiet, and the role settled even deeper into the team's culture. If something was complicated, it often drifted toward me. If something required careful attention, someone would say my name. And when meetings ended, people would often leave the room with the comfortable assumption that the details would somehow resolve themselves through me. The strange thing was, I didn't feel angry about it. Not at first. Because competence can become its own trap. When you know you're capable of solving problems, it feels easier to just fix them than to challenge the system that created them. So I kept doing what I had always done, organizing timelines, catching mistakes before they reach clients, maintaining the quiet structure that allowed the team to function smoothly. From the outside, everything looked stable. But internally, something subtle had started shifting. Not in the office, in me. Because documenting those small moments, the comments, the assumptions, the casual way my time was treated, was slowly building a kind of clarity. I wasn't imagining the pattern. And once a pattern becomes visible, it's difficult to pretend it isn't there. Still, I told myself it wasn't a serious issue. Every workplace has small imbalances. Every team has roles that form naturally over time. Maybe this was simply mine. Maybe being the quiet person who keeps things working was enough. For a while, that explanation felt comfortable, until the day I realized something important. The role everyone thought I was playing wasn't the one I had actually agreed to, and that realization would become much harder to ignore. The moment I truly understood my role on the team didn't happen during a meeting. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon while I was standing by the coffee machine in the break room. The office was quiet in that mid-afternoon way when everyone's energy dips. A few people were scrolling through their phones. Someone was reheating leftovers in the microwave. I was pouring coffee into a paper cup when I overheard a conversation behind me. Two co-workers from the product team, Mark and Sophie, were talking near the window. They weren't whispering, they weren't gossiping. They were just talking casually, the way people do when they think no one particularly important is listening. Mark said something about a scheduling conflict with one of our vendors. Sophie shrugged. Just send it to Era, she said. She'll sort it out. There was no malice in her voice. If anything, it sounded practical. Mark laughed lightly. Yeah, she's basically the office operating system. They both chuckled. And then they walked out of the break room. I stood there for a moment with my coffee cup in my hand, thinking about that phrase, the office operating system. It was meant as a compliment, but it also revealed something very specific. Operating systems aren't visible. They run quietly in the background, so other people can use the applications they actually care about. If they work perfectly, no one thinks about them at all. But when they fail, suddenly everyone notices. I walked back to my desk and opened my Navy notebook. For a few minutes, I flipped through the pages I'd been filling over the past several weeks. There were short sentences written in the margins. That's why we keep Era around. Era will figure it out. Just send it to Era. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a very clear picture. Without ever saying it directly, the team had assigned me a role that was both important and strangely invisible. I was the stabilizer, the problem solver, the person who made complicated things simpler for everyone else, but not the person whose voice shaped decisions, not the person whose time required negotiation, just the reliable system running quietly beneath the work that everyone else felt more connected to. And the strange part was that I had participated in building that perception. I rarely interrupted people. I rarely pushed back on last minute requests. When something went wrong, I focused on fixing it rather than explaining why the problem had happened. Those choices had felt professional at the time, but over the years, they had also created a very specific narrative about me, one where my value existed mostly in the background. That realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me thoughtful because the role I had been assigned wasn't entirely wrong. I was good at keeping things running smoothly. I did understand the operational systems of the company better than most people in the department. But the difference between being capable of something and being defined only by that thing is enormous. And until that afternoon in the break room, I hadn't fully recognized how narrow the team's definition of me had become. A few minutes later, Derek walked past my desk. He stopped briefly, holding his laptop. "Hey, Era," he said casually. "Quick thing, of course. There's a vendor contract from last quarter that finance is asking about. I don't remember the details. Can you check it out?" I looked up at him. "Sure," I said calmly. He smiled. "Knew you'd have it covered." Then he walked away before I could respond. I opened the contract database and located the document he was referring to. Within 10 minutes, I had the answer. Within 15 minutes, I had written a short summary explaining exactly what finance needed to know. I sent the message. Problem solved. But while I worked, something quiet was shifting in the back of my mind. Not resentment, not frustration, just awareness. Because roles in workplaces are often invisible agreements. They form slowly through habits, expectations, and repeated behavior. And once they solidify, people begin to treat them as if they've always existed. That afternoon, for the first time, I realized something important. The role everyone thought I played was not permanent. It was simply the one I had allowed to exist. And understanding that difference changes the way you see everything around you. At that moment, I still wasn't planning to challenge anything. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. But a small, quiet question had begun forming in my mind. What would happen if I stopped playing the role exactly the way everyone expected? I didn't know the answer yet. But soon, something small would happen that made the question impossible to ignore. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. No one raised their voice. No one accused anyone of anything. In fact, the moment that changed everything for me was so quiet that no one else in the office noticed it at all. It was early, still dark outside. I remember because the city lights were reflecting off the rain on the windows when I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on my nightstand. 6:18 a.m. At first, I thought it might be a client issue. Occasionally, something urgent would come up overnight, especially with vendors in different time zones. I reached for my phone and saw a Slack notification from Derek. The message had been sent to the entire team. Emergency meeting, 7 a.m., conference room B mandatory. I sat up in bed. Emergency meetings at that hour almost always meant one thing in our department. Something had gone very wrong. A project failure, a major client problem, a compliance issue, something serious. Within a few minutes, my phone started lighting up with messages from coworkers. Do you know what this is about? Did something happen with the rollout? Please tell me you know more than I do. I didn't. But I got dressed quickly and headed into the office. When I arrived a little before 7, the conference room was already filling up. People were walking in with that particular mix of tension and exhaustion that comes from being called into work unexpectedly. Lena sat down beside me, whispering quietly. Do you think it's the vendor delay? She asked. I'm not sure, I said. Across the room, Mark was already opening his laptop. This better not be about the analytics dashboard again, he muttered. Everyone looked serious, focused, slightly anxious. Because when a manager calls an emergency meeting that early, people assume it's for a reason. At exactly 7:02, Derek walked in carrying a coffee and his laptop. He looked relaxed. Not the kind of focused energy you'd expect from someone about to deliver difficult news. He set his laptop down, connected it to the screen, and smiled at the room. Morning, everyone, he said cheerfully. A few people nodded politely. There was a brief pause. Then Derek pulled up a slide on the screen. It wasn't a project timeline. It wasn't financial data. It wasn't anything related to our work at all. It was a screenshot of a fantasy football roster. For a moment, the room was completely silent. I remember thinking that maybe it was a joke slide, something he had opened by accident before getting to the real presentation. But Derek leaned back against the table and took a sip of his coffee. Okay, he said. I need some opinions. No one spoke. I've got a trade offer, he continued, pointing at the screen. And I can't decide if it's worth it. The silence deepened. Someone near the door shifted in their chair. Derek kept talking. This guy wants to send me 2 mid-tier receivers for my starting running back, he explained. On paper, it looks balanced, but I'm worried about playoff upside. He looked around the room expectantly. So I figured, team vote. I glanced slowly around the table. The expressions were almost identical. Confusion, disbelief, polite restraint. For a few seconds, no one responded. Then Mark gave a short laugh. Wait, he said. This meeting is about your fantasy team? Derek grinned. Exactly. A couple of people chuckled awkwardly. The tension in the room shifted into something stranger, an uneasy mixture of relief and disbelief. For the next 30 minutes, Derek walked us through possible trade scenarios. He asked for opinions. He debated player statistics. At one point, he even created a quick poll on the screen so people could vote. Most of the team played along. Some people joked. Others offered half-serious suggestions. Eventually, the room settled into a strange, sleepy participation. But I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my notebook open, watching. Not angry, not embarrassed, just observing. Because something about that moment crystallized everything I had been quietly noticing over the past several months. The early messages, the casual assumptions, the small sentences that reduced people's time and effort into something flexible. This meeting wasn't just about fantasy football. It was about priorities, about the quiet hierarchy of whose time mattered. And as I watched Derek laughing and debating trade strategies while 15 employees sat around a conference table before sunrise, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a calm, unmistakable clarity. For the first time since joining the company, I realized something important. The system I had been helping maintain was not built on the kind of respect I had assumed. And once you see that clearly, a very simple question begins to form. What do you do with that knowledge? At the time, I didn't have the answer yet, but something inside me had already changed. And from that moment forward, my silence would no longer mean the same thing it once did. After the meeting ended, people walked out of the conference room with a strange mixture of emotions. Some were laughing, others were shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. Mark muttered something under his breath about the most expensive fantasy football consultation in history. Lena gave me a quick glance as we packed up our things, the kind of look that said, "Did that really just happen?" But no one said anything to Derek. And that part fascinated me, because the moment itself had been ridiculous. 15 professionals summoned before sunrise to vote on a fantasy football trade. On any reasonable scale of workplace priorities, it was absurd. Yet, the team had accepted it. They joked about it. They rolled their eyes privately. But no one challenged it. Not loudly, not even gently. By the time we reached our desks, the morning had already returned to normal. Emails, deadlines, status updates. As if the past 30 minutes had simply been an unusual but harmless detour. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the day's task list. On the surface, nothing had changed. But internally, something had settled into place. For years, my silence had been automatic. When people overlooked my contributions, I stayed quiet. When Derek casually assigned complicated work without discussion, I handled it. When small comments minimized my role, I ignored them. Not because I felt powerless, because I believed professionalism meant absorbing small discomforts without creating friction. But that morning had reframed something for me. It wasn't just about one strange meeting. It was about the culture that allowed it to feel normal. The casual way a manager assumed everyone's time was available for something entirely unrelated to their work. The quiet expectation that the team would participate without question. And most interesting of all, the fact that no one pushed back. Not because they agreed, because they had learned not to disrupt the structure of the room. The same structure that had quietly placed me in the role of the reliable background system. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me curious. Because if the system was built on quite a few assumptions, then the people who understood those assumptions had more influence than anyone realized. And I understood them very well. Later that afternoon, Derek stopped by my desk. "Hey, Era," he said, leaning casually against the partition. "Thanks for humoring me this morning." I looked up. "Of course." He smiled. "You should have voted, though. You would have tipped the poll." I closed my notebook. I was just observing. "Observing?" he repeated with a laugh. "Habit," I said. He nodded, clearly not thinking much about the comment. Well, he added, we'll see if the trade pays off. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear down the hallway. For a moment, I considered saying something about the meeting. Not in an angry way, just a simple observation. Maybe we don't need to schedule early meetings for personal things. But I didn't say it. Not because I was avoiding conflict. Because for the first time, my silence felt intentional. Before, silence had been a default. Now, it was a decision. I turned back to my laptop and opened a document I had been maintaining quietly for months. A record of operational processes, vendor contracts, approval chains, compliance checkpoints. Most people on the team had never seen it. But it contained something interesting, a complete map of how our department actually functioned. Who approved what? Where delays occurred? Which systems depended on which people? It was the kind of information you accumulate slowly when you sit in the background of an organization long enough. I had originally created it for efficiency. Now, as I scrolled through the pages, I realized it represented something else: perspective, understanding, leverage, not in an aggressive sense, but in the quiet way knowledge shapes outcomes. Outside my desk, the office moved through the usual afternoon rhythm. Phones ringing, chairs rolling across the floor, conversations about deadlines and deliverables. From the outside, I looked exactly the same as I always had: calm, focused. The quiet operations coordinator is reviewing documents at her desk. But internally, the meaning of my silence had changed. Because once you stop speaking out of habit, you start listening more carefully. And when you listen carefully enough, you begin to notice things other people overlook. Small details, hidden dependencies, unspoken vulnerabilities in the system that everyone assumes will always work. Over the next few weeks, those details would start forming a very clear picture, one that no one else on the team seemed to notice. At least, not yet. For the next several weeks, nothing about my behavior looked different from the outside. I still arrived at the office early. I still attended meetings with the same navy notebook. I still answered questions when someone asked about timelines or documentation. If anyone had been watching carefully, they might have noticed something small. I was asking more questions, not confrontational questions, just clarifying ones. How is this vendor approval usually documented? Who signs off on that after Derek? Do we keep archived copies of those reports? Or just the summaries? Most people answered casually without thinking much about it. Because questions like that felt normal coming from someone in operations. But behind those questions, I was doing something slightly different than before. I was mapping the system more completely. Over the years, I had already learned a lot about how the department functioned. That's what happens when you're the person who handles the small logistical gaps between teams. But now, I was paying attention to something deeper: dependencies. Which processes relied on specific people? Which documents only existed in one place? Which approvals moved automatically because everyone trusted that someone else had already checked them? It turns out that most organizations run on a surprising amount of quiet assumptions. For example, Derek signed off on several vendor agreements every quarter, but he didn't actually review the compliance documentation himself. He trusted that the operations summary, usually written by me, accurately reflected the details. Finance processed payments based on those approvals. Legal archived the contracts. Everyone trusted the system, and the system trusted the person maintaining it. None of this was secret. It was simply unnoticed. During one meeting, Mark complained about a delayed vendor invoice. Finance is asking for documentation again, he said. I swear they lose the same files every quarter. I looked up from my notebook. They're not losing them, I said calmly. What do you mean? The archive only stores the final contract version, I explained. The compliance summaries are stored separately. Mark blinked. Where? In the operations repository. He paused. Wait, you manage that? Yes. The conversation moved on quickly, but moments like that happened more frequently than people realized. Small realizations that many of the quiet operational systems running beneath the department were connected through processes I maintained. Not because anyone had officially assigned that responsibility, because over time, I had become the person who noticed gaps and filled them. The office culture had interpreted that as helpfulness. What they hadn't recognized was how much institutional knowledge those gaps had gradually placed in my hands. One afternoon, while reviewing archived documents, I came across something interesting. A vendor agreement from 2 years earlier. It contained a clause that required quarterly performance verification before renewal. Technically, the department had been following that requirement. But the verification reports had quietly evolved into short summary notes. Again, usually written by me, rather than full documentation. No one had questioned the change, because the summaries were clear and accurate, and because Derek trusted them. I closed the document and sat back in my chair. Again, there was no wrongdoing here, no scandal. Just another example of how organizations simplify processes when they trust the people maintaining them. But trust has an interesting side effect. It concentrates responsibility in places people rarely examine closely. That evening, after most of the office had gone home, I stayed at my desk for a little while longer. Not working overtime, just reviewing the map I had been building. Vendor relationships, approval chains, internal documentation systems. None of it felt dramatic. It simply clarified how much of the department's operational continuity depended on systems that most people barely thought about. And most of those systems had been shaped by me. Not because I had tried to create influence, because I had been quietly making things work for years. The difference now was that I finally understood the full shape of that influence. I closed my laptop and placed my notebook back into my bag. Outside the windows, the city lights reflected softly on the dark glass. For a long time, I had believed my role in the company was purely supportive. Now I was starting to see something else. Not power in the traditional sense, but leverage in the quiet way systems depend on the people who understand them best. And soon, I would discover something even more interesting. A piece of information that clarified exactly how much leverage that knowledge could create. Not something I had been searching for, just something I happened to notice, the way quiet observers often do. The discovery didn't feel dramatic when it happened. There was no sudden realization, no moment where everything clicked into place all at once. It was simply another quiet afternoon at my desk, reviewing documentation the way I had done hundreds of times before. I was organizing vendor records from the previous fiscal year, updating the internal archive so finance could access the summaries more easily. Most of the work was routine: file names, timestamps, confirmation emails, the kind of administrative maintenance that rarely attracts attention but keeps entire systems functioning. About halfway through the review, I opened a renewal folder for one of our largest external partners. They handled a significant portion of our infrastructure support. Their contract was substantial, and it renewed automatically every year unless one of the departments flagged a change. I scrolled through the documents slowly. Agreement, amendment, performance summaries. Everything looked normal until I reached the compliance verification section. I paused. The last full verification report in the archive was from 2 years earlier. After that, the records consisted of the shorter internal summaries that had gradually replaced the longer reports. The summaries weren't inaccurate. They reflected the vendor's performance honestly. But technically, according to the contract language, the formal verification process required a specific format. A format that hadn't been submitted in a while. I leaned back slightly in my chair and reread the clause. It wasn't a crisis. The vendor was performing well. No one had raised concerns about their service. And the summaries we had submitted internally captured the same information that the formal reports would have included. But the contract wording was very precise. Formal verification documentation was required before each renewal. Without it, the renewal process technically relied on internal approval rather than documented compliance. I sat quietly for a moment. This wasn't anyone's mistake in the dramatic sense. It was simply the kind of procedural shortcut that evolves slowly when people trust the system to keep working. Over time, the shorter summaries had become normal. Derek approved them. Finance processed payments. Legal archived the agreements. Everyone assumed the process remained exactly as the contract described. And because I was the person writing those summaries, I had never thought much about the change either, until now. I opened the contract history again and compared the dates. Then I checked the renewal schedule for the upcoming quarter. The next renewal for this vendor would happen in about 6 weeks, which meant something interesting. If someone reviewed the contract strictly by its written requirements, they would expect the formal verification report, not the simplified summary. And because the summaries had been accepted for so long, no one else seemed to realize the difference existed. I closed the document and folded my hands on the desk. Again, this wasn't a scandal. It wasn't even particularly unusual. Organizations adjust processes constantly as teams grow more comfortable with each other. But clarity has a way of revealing leverage where none seemed to exist before. Not leverage in an aggressive sense, just information that changes how decisions can be made. At that moment, I understood something very simple. The operational systems our department relied on were more fragile than they appeared. Not because they were poorly designed, because they depended heavily on habits. And habits are easy to overlook until someone examines them closely. I saved a copy of the contract documentation in my private reference folder, not as evidence, just as information. Then I closed the file and returned to the rest of my work. Across the office, people were finishing their afternoon meetings. Someone laughed near the break room. Phones rang softly in the background. Everything looked normal. And in most ways, it still was. But inside my mind, something had shifted again. For the first time, I could see a very specific point where the quiet knowledge I carried intersected with the formal structure of the organization. Not dramatically, just clearly. And clarity has a powerful effect. Because once you understand where systems bend slightly away from their official shape, you begin to see the choices available to you, not just the choices people expect you to make, the ones they never imagined you might consider. At that point, I still hadn't decided what I would do with that knowledge. But the decision itself was starting to form. And once a decision begins to take shape internally, it's usually only a matter of time before the rest of the story follows. Once you see a system clearly, the hardest part isn't understanding it. The hardest part is deciding what to do with that understanding. For the next few days, I didn't act immediately on the information I had discovered. I continued working exactly as before, reviewing documents, coordinating schedules, responding to messages. From the outside, nothing about my behavior changed. But internally, I was thinking carefully, not emotionally, strategically. Because the moment you realize you have leverage inside an organization, several possible paths appear at the same time. The first option was the simplest: ignore it. I could continue doing my job exactly the way I always had. When the vendor renewal came up, I could prepare another summary the way we had done for years. Derek would approve it. Finance would process the renewal. The system would continue running smoothly. That option had one advantage: it required no change. But it also meant accepting the same quiet imbalance that had been forming around my role for years. The second option was confrontation. I could walk into Derek's office and explain the contract clause. I could point out that the formal verification reports hadn't been submitted recently and suggest we correct the process before renewal. It would be responsible, professional. But I already understood how that conversation would unfold. Derek would probably thank me, maybe make a quick comment about "good catch," and then ask me to prepare the full documentation. The system would adjust slightly, but the structure around it, the assumptions about whose time solved these problems, would remain exactly the same. The third option was more complicated, not dramatic, just irreversible. Because the contract clause didn't just require documentation, it required formal verification before renewal approval. And renewal approval ultimately passed through a chain that included Derek, finance leadership, and legal review. In other words, if the process followed the written structure instead of the simplified one everyone had become used to, the review would expand beyond our small department. Not as a complaint, not as an accusation, simply as a correction. I opened my notebook and wrote a short list. 3 options: ignore, confront, or restore the system to its official structure. Each path had consequences. Ignoring the issue preserved the status quo. Confrontation solved the technical problem but changed very little culturally. The third option, quietly returning the process to its original framework, would introduce new visibility into how the department operated. Not because I would be exposing anything, because the contract itself required it. I sat with that thought for a long time. Outside the office windows, The late afternoon sunlight was fading slowly behind the buildings. People were beginning to pack up their laptops. Conversations about dinner plans floated softly across the room. Normal life, normal work. And in the middle of it all, I realized something simple. For years, I had been helping maintain systems that allowed other people to move quickly and comfortably through their work. That wasn't a bad thing, but the cost of that convenience had slowly become my invisibility. Not maliciously, just structurally. The third option, the irreversible one, didn't involve revenge. It didn't even involve conflict. All it required was something very small, following the rules exactly as they were written. No shortcuts, no simplified summaries, just the formal process. I closed my notebook. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt calm. Because sometimes the most powerful action isn't creating a new system. It's simply allowing the existing one to function exactly as designed. The next step would be quiet, methodical, almost invisible. But once it began, the consequences would eventually reach people who had never thought about the operational structure beneath their daily work. And by the time they realized what had changed, it would already be too late to return to the comfortable habits they had relied on for years. The following week looked ordinary from the outside. Meetings happened, deadlines approached, Slack notifications filled the day the way they always did. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that I was working a little more methodically than usual. But in operations, methodical behavior rarely attracts attention. It just looks like good organization. The first step was simple: documentation. Instead of preparing the usual short performance summary for the vendor renewal, I opened a new document and began compiling the full verification report exactly as the contract described. Every section: performance metrics, service delivery logs, response times, infrastructure reliability statistics, compliance confirmations. It took several hours across 2 afternoons. Not because the information was difficult to find, I already knew where most of it lived, but because the formal report required supporting attachments and cross-referenced approvals. The process was slower than the simplified summaries we had been using, but it was also extremely clear. Once the report was complete, I uploaded it to the official compliance repository rather than the internal operations folder. That was the second quiet shift. Normally, the summaries stayed within our department's documentation system. Only Derek and a few others reviewed them before renewal approval. The formal verification report, however, belonged in the broader compliance archive, one that finance leadership and legal teams also had access to. Not because I wanted attention, because that was the location specified in the contract. After uploading the file, I sent a short message to Derek. Hi Derek, I've completed the vendor performance verification report for the upcoming renewal cycle. It's in the compliance repository under infrastructure support, annual review. Let me know if you'd like a summary. A few minutes later, his reply appeared. Perfect, thanks Era. Nothing unusual. No questions. Which didn't surprise me. Derek trusted that operational documentation meant the process had been handled correctly. He rarely reviewed the full reports unless something had gone wrong. Later that afternoon, finance requested the renewal documentation checklist. Normally, I would have attached the one-page summary. Instead, I included the formal verification report along with the supporting files. The response came back quickly. Thanks, received. Again, nothing unusual. Because the system had been designed to handle documentation exactly like this. The difference was that no one had followed the process so precisely in a long time. For several days, everything continued quietly. No alarms, no urgent messages, just the normal rhythm of office work. But systems inside organizations often move slowly at first. Documents are reviewed in the background. Approval chains pass through inboxes. Legal teams glance at clauses they haven't needed to examine closely for years. And when something slightly different appears in those systems, something more detailed than expected, it tends to trigger curiosity, not suspicion, just attention. One afternoon, about a week after uploading the report, I noticed a small notification in the compliance system. Document accessed, legal review. A few minutes later, another. Finance director, document opened. I closed the notification window and continued working. No one contacted me that day or the next. But something had begun moving through the larger organizational structure, quietly. Exactly the way formal processes are designed to move. The interesting thing about restoring a system to its official structure is that it doesn't look like disruption. It looks like compliance, which means the people who begin asking questions aren't reacting to a complaint. They're simply responding to the rules that already exist. And rules, once activated, tend to travel farther than anyone initially expects. A few days later, Derek walked past my desk. Quick thing error, he said. I looked up. Sure. Finance asked about the vendor verification report. He said casually. Apparently, the documentation is more detailed this year. I nodded. Yes, I followed the full contract format. He blinked slightly. Oh, then he shrugged. Well, thorough is good. He smiled and continued down the hallway. From his perspective, nothing important had changed. But inside the broader system of the company, something subtle had already begun unfolding. And once processes like that begin moving through departments, they rarely stop halfway. At first, the consequences were so small that most people didn't connect them to anything specific. A question here, a delay there, nothing dramatic. Just small ripples moving quietly through the department. The first ripple appeared during our weekly project meeting. Derek was running through the usual updates when he paused briefly, glancing at his laptop. Quick note, he said. Finance is reviewing the infrastructure vendor renewal a bit more closely this cycle. Nothing major, just some additional verification. No one reacted strongly. Vendor reviews happened occasionally. Most people in the room barely interacted with those processes anyway. Mark shrugged. As long as it doesn't slow down the support team, he said. It shouldn't, Derek replied, and the meeting continued. But over the next few days, more small signs appeared. Finance asked for a timeline of performance reports from the previous 2 years. Legal requested clarification about the compliance documentation format. Someone from procurement sent a polite message asking if the vendor verification process had recently changed. None of these questions sounded accusatory. They sounded curious, which is exactly how internal systems usually react when something breaks the pattern they've grown used to. I answered each request calmly. providing dates, pointing to documentation, explaining the contract clause that required formal verification before renewal. Every answer was factual. Every document already existed. I wasn't introducing new information. I was simply pointing to the structure that had always been there. One afternoon, Lena rolled her chair over to my desk. "Hey," she said quietly, "do you know why finance suddenly cares so much about the infrastructure vendor?" I looked up from my screen. They're reviewing the renewal documentation. "Yeah, but they've never done this before." I thought about that for a moment. They're probably just following the contract language more closely this year. She tilted her head. Huh. Then she rolled back to her desk. Across the office, people continued working normally. But the subtle ripple continued spreading. Because when multiple departments start reviewing the same process, something interesting happens. The informal shortcuts that once made things efficient begin to disappear. Legal flagged the documentation format discrepancy between older summaries and the new verification report. Finance noticed that the simplified summaries from previous cycles didn't technically match the contract requirements. Procurement asked whether the verification process should be standardized moving forward. None of these questions implied blame. They were simply the natural result of looking at the system through its official rules instead of its habitual shortcuts. Late one afternoon, Derek stopped by my desk again. This time, he looked slightly puzzled. "Hey, Era," he said. "Did something change with the vendor verification process?" "No," I replied calmly. "I followed the format specified in the contract." He frowned slightly. Legal mentioned that earlier summaries were shorter. "Yep," I said. "Those were internal summaries." He leaned back against the partition, thinking. "So, technically, the full report is the correct version." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Interesting." For a moment, he looked like he was trying to reconstruct how the process had evolved over the past few years. But habits are difficult to trace once they've been running quietly for a long time. Eventually, he shrugged. "Well, better to have everything documented properly," he said. "I agree." He gave a quick nod and walked away. From his perspective, this was simply an administrative adjustment. But inside the larger organizational structure, the consequences were beginning to compound. Because once legal and finance both become involved in reviewing a contract process, the review rarely stops with a single document. They start asking broader questions. How long has the process worked this way? Should the documentation format be standardized across vendors? Were earlier approvals technically compliant with the contract language? Not accusations, just procedural clarity. By the end of the week, the renewal timeline had been temporarily paused for a formal verification review. It was the first time that had happened since I joined the company. And the interesting part was that no one could point to a single person who had caused the change, because no one had broken a rule. In fact, the opposite was true. Someone had simply followed the rules exactly. And once that happens, systems begin correcting themselves automatically, even if the people who relied on the shortcuts haven't realized it yet. The first signs that something had changed were almost invisible. Nothing dramatic happened when I left. The systems I built didn't crash. The dashboards didn't disappear. Everything kept running, at least on the surface. But small things started to shift. Reports that used to appear automatically each Monday morning started arriving later. Forecast models that leadership depended on began producing numbers that were slightly harder to interpret. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. For years, I had quietly maintained the automation behind those systems, the scripts, the adjustments, the small calibrations that kept everything aligned. Most people never saw that work. They just saw the results. When I left, the systems didn't break. They simply lost the person who understood how they truly worked. Weeks later, questions began appearing in meetings. Why were reporting timelines inconsistent? Why were certain projections suddenly harder to update? My former manager reportedly answered the same way he always had. I'll have someone look into it. But this time, there wasn't a someone, because the person who used to quietly handle those things had already moved on. And that's when people finally started connecting the dots. Not with panic, but with a slow, uncomfortable realization. Some roles seem invisible while they exist, but the moment they disappear, their absence becomes impossible to ignore. And by the time that realization arrived, there was nothing left to fix. A few weeks later, I received a phone call. Unknown number. When I answered, the voice on the other end paused before speaking. Era, it's Daniel, my former manager. We exchanged a few polite sentences before he finally explained why he was calling. The reporting systems you built, we've been having trouble adjusting them. Of course, they had. He asked if I could help explain how everything worked. I thought about it for a moment before answering calmly. Those systems were part of my role while I worked there. Yes, I understand. And I left transition notes before I resigned. Another quiet pause. They didn't include all the details, he admitted. I understood what he meant. For years, the company had relied on knowledge that lived almost entirely in my head. But that had never been my responsibility to carry forever. Eventually, he asked a different question. Did we underestimate how much you were doing? I took a moment before answering. I think people just got used to things working. He sighed softly. I should have paid more attention. There was no argument, no tension, just a simple moment of clarity between two professionals. Sometimes, confrontation doesn't need anger. Sometimes it only needs honesty. Starting a new job felt quieter than I expected. Not exciting in a dramatic way, just calm. The work was similar. I was still designing systems, solving operational problems, and building tools that helped organizations run more smoothly. But the environment felt different. People asked questions about the work. They listened to the answers, and when something functioned well, someone usually said so. It sounds simple, but after years of working quietly in the background, that kind of recognition felt unfamiliar. Leaving my old job didn't change who I was. I'm still someone who prefers calm over confrontation. I still believe the best work often happens behind the scenes. But I no longer assume that reliability means invisibility. Now, when I contribute something meaningful, I allow that work to be seen, not for attention, just because accuracy matters. Looking back, that early morning meeting about fantasy football wasn't the real problem. It was simply the moment when I realized something important. Clarity doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes It arrives quietly. And once you see things clearly, you begin choosing where your effort truly belongs. Looking back now, the strange thing is that the story people remember the most is the 7 a.m. meeting, the emergency meeting, the one where everyone rushed into the conference room thinking a major client issue had exploded overnight, only to discover that our manager wanted help deciding whether he should trade a running back on his fantasy football team. At the time, it felt ridiculous. But that moment wasn't really the problem. It was just the clearest example of something that had been happening quietly for a long time. When people's time, attention, and effort are taken for granted, it rarely starts with something dramatic. It begins with small assumptions that someone will handle the work, that someone will stay late to make sure things function, that someone will quietly solve problems no one else notices, and that someone slowly becomes part of the background. Reliable people often end up living in that background, not because they lack talent, but because they care enough to keep things running smoothly. The truth I eventually learned is this: being dependable is a strength, but invisibility should never be the cost of that strength. For a long time, I believed that if I kept doing excellent work quietly, the right people would eventually notice. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And when they don't, the responsibility isn't always to work harder. Sometimes the responsibility is simply to choose a different environment. One where respect isn't something you earn through exhaustion. One where the systems you build and the time you give are treated with care. I never needed revenge. I never needed anyone to fail. The only thing I needed was clarity. Once I had that, the rest of the decisions became surprisingly simple. I moved forward. I built new systems. I worked with people who valued the quiet parts of the job, the details that make organizations stable. And the strange thing is, I still think about that morning sometimes, not with anger, but as a reminder. Because every career has moments that reveal more than they seem to at first. Moments where you suddenly realize how others see your time, your work, and your presence. Sometimes those moments feel small, but they can quietly change the direction of your life. So now, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment at work where you suddenly realized your effort was being taken for granted? And if you did you stay and try to change things? Or did you decide it was time to move on? I'd really like to hear your story.